Hello and welcome to the Progress Theory, where we discuss scientific principles for optimizing human performance. I am Dr. Phil Price, and on today's episode, we're joined by Dr. Matt Lee, a Postdoctoral Research Fellow from the Institute of Sport and Health at Victoria University in Melbourne. Now, it was originally thought that you couldn't develop strength and endurance simultaneously because of something called the interference effect. There are certain molecular, hormonal, or neuromuscular adaptations which occur that when you're training for both at the same time, they blunt the other. So, for example, if you're training to develop strength and you do a load of endurance work on top of that, that endurance work would actually disrupt your strength adaptations. However, it's not as simple as that. And there are a lot of factors like training intensity or the recovery time between sessions that we as coaches can actually manipulate to try and reduce the interference effect as much as possible. Dr. Matt Lee is a research specialist in concurrent training. And on today's episode, we actually focus on where the interference effects was first discovered, what certain training factors can actually blunt adaptations, and what you can do to train strength and endurance simultaneously. As always, follow The Progress Theory on Instagram, YouTube, and head to theprogresstheory.com to our website where you can see all of our other episodes. So here is Dr. Matt Lee. Hey Matt, how are you doing?
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you so much for coming on. Obviously, this is all for the new series of the Progress Theory, and we're going a bit niche with this series, really focusing on concurrent training, or certainly how we can develop, endurance sport and a strength sport kind of simultaneously. So having you on and your expertise in this area is really great. So thank you so much for coming on.
No problem.
Do you want to give a bit of an introduction to yourself?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'm originally from the UK. Hopefully you can still hear from my accent. I often get pulled up by friends and family that I'm sounding more Aussie every time I call home. But I'm from Leighton Buzzard in Bedfordshire, and I studied at Liverpool John Moores University. I did my undergrad in sports science, and then stayed on to do sports physiology. And then I always had sort of aspirations of doing a PhD, and had sort of applied for a few places in the UK. Wasn't successful at the time, so I was just working for a sports supplement manufacturer for a little bit, which was kind of cool. Sort of see a bit of the industry side of things. And then was approached by John Bartlett, who became my PhD supervisor. He'd moved over to Australia to work for the Western Bulldogs Australian football team, and Victoria University, where I currently work, and the Bulldogs have a partnership, and he mentioned that he was looking to set up some PhD projects, and one in particular in concurrent training, and it gave me the opportunity to sort of put in an application for that, and moved over here in 2015. So I'm in Melbourne at the Institute for Health and Sport at Victoria University. And then I did my PhD, finished in 2019. So that was with John Bartlett and Professor David Bishop. And then I was fortunate enough at the end of my PhD to be offered a postdoc position to stay on in David's lab and continue working as part of a research partnership that he's set up with the Australian Defence Force. So my current research, my postdoc position at the moment is, investigating nutritional strategies to enhance exercise adaptations and performance, with a specific focus now on sort of manipulating post-exercise carbohydrate intake and the effects that has on training adaptations. I think that's what's a stop tour of my background.
Oh, that's cool. That explains a lot. So obviously reading around concurrent training, like I came across your work, and one of the reasons why I contacted you. And I did notice on your research a little bit of a change in direction towards the recent papers that you released. So that does make sense around sort of carbohydrate strategies and that particular area.
Yeah. So when I was back at John Moores, during my master's dissertation was with Professor James Morton and Graham Close. And And so that's also the link with John, because John was doing his PhD at John Moores when I was doing my master's. So we sort of, and James was his supervisor. So there was kind of a connection there. That's kind of how we knew each other and had a few mutual friends. And then, obviously then when he moved over here and was looking for people who might be interested in doing a PhD, sort of, reached out to me. But yeah, the master's was in sort of carbohydrate and hydration strategies to support half marathon performance, and sports nutrition was kind of something I became really interested in my undergrad and in my master's, and then concurrent training came along through the PhD with John, and now I've sort of transitioned back a little bit into sort of nutritional strategies, but still feel like I've got a bit of work to do in concurrent training as well.
They sound like they're linked very well together. Like the transitions are very fluid, because nutrition is one of the key factors which could affect the effectiveness of concurrent training.
Yeah, definitely. And it's I know I'm probably going to end up repeating myself a lot today, but it's certainly an area in concurrent training that has received little attention. And the nutritional recommendations to optimize concurrent training adaptations are kind of limited to an extent to research that's been conducted in endurance only or resistance only studies. There's been very little stuff looking at what happens when we bring these both together in a training program, whether it's the same day or the same week. There's been a few acute studies looking at protein intake and the effect that has on stimulating protein synthesis and my like the sort of molecular signal. So mTOR is a classic sort of signaling pathway and protein involved in resistance training adaptation. So there's been a few studies in that, and I know of like one long-term training study looking at the effects of high protein diets on concurrent training adaptations. But that's about it as far as I can think of. So there's a lot of areas to unravel, really.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think there's a lack of research in the nutritional space regarding concurrent training? That's the first thing I thought of is it's really hard. Like concurrent training studies themselves, just from my own experience, are really challenging. We really need more long-term training studies to really understand this interference effect and how it is affected by different training variables. But it's really challenging to get people to commit to a prolonged period. There's so much to control, like you say, and then on top of that, as I mentioned in my current position, we've just started a new training study, a training and nutrition intervention, and it just feels like it's next level. Like having to organize people's training and get them to kind of adhere to the training program. But then on top of that, there's all this food prep and meal plans and all that goes with it as well. It's just it's challenging. So you need a lot of resources and a good team around you as well to help facilitate that. And so I think that's why a lot of the studies you'll see are either acute studies or sort of, 10 to, I think 24 weeks is sort of some of the longer term studies that I've seen. But yeah, it's just really, really challenging, I think. There's definitely a few terms I'd like to go over, especially if there's anyone listening to the podcast who are kind of new to what concurrent training is. Do you want to, let's start off with, could you explain what concurrent training is, and then what is this interference effect?
Yeah, definitely. So concurrent training is basically the term that's given to a training program that incorporates endurance and resistance training. So that might be performing endurance and resistance training in the same session, or it might be in the same day, but separated by a few hours of recovery, or performing them on different days. But an overall sort of training program that incorporates two different types of training, endurance and resistance, is concurrent training. And the interference effect that you mentioned is basically this idea and principle that adaptations to endurance and resistance training are very different when you look at a 100% trained endurance athlete and a power lifter or a weightlifter that does no cardio. Like, the adaptations are very, very different. And so it's this idea that when we train them both together, that there's something about the training that interferes, and we're not able to adapt to the resistance training. So hallmark adaptations, strength, muscle mass, power, don't adapt or increase as much when you combine it with endurance training compared to doing resistance training alone. And this was something that was first looked at back in 1980. So there's this classic study by Robert Hickson, which basically looked at, it was a 10-week training program, and there was recreationally active men and women, and they trained either for 10 weeks, either performing resistance-only training, endurance-only training, or a combination of the two. And what they found is that over the course of the 10 weeks, the resistance-only group improved their leg press 1 rep max on a weekly basis. The endurance group improved their VO2 max. But what they found with the concurrent group is that when it came to the strength adaptations, the lower body strength, the leg press 1RM, plateaued at around sort of week 7, and then even sort of began to decline over the subsequent 3 weeks of the program. And so it kind of brought about this idea that, putting these two very different, very contrasting modes of training together may lead to some level of interference. And that first study by Hickson sort of considered the sort of seminal paper, very kind of founding work. And since then, there have been several studies showing that when you combine endurance and resistance together, that adaptations in dynamic strength, lean mass, and power don't improve as much. But I guess when we look, there's been 30 years of research has passed since that very first paper by Hickson, and now when we sort of look at the research as a whole, it actually seems that the interference effect and we can dive in a little bit more to this, but the adaptations to strength and lean mass in particular aren't as susceptible to this interference effect as perhaps we thought. And it's more explosive power that seems to be the main resistance variable that is susceptible to this interference effect. And I think what the way the kind of field's developed over the last 30 years or so is that we've sort of gained an appreciation of how manipulating different training variables can dictate whether we see an interference effect and how much of an interference that we might get. So I'm probably rambling a bit here now, but going back to that first paper by Hickson, when we look at the actual training that they did, the participants were absolutely beasted. They were lifting 5 days a week, and it was I think even in the paper it says like they were instructed to lift as much as you can, and it was around about 80% of their 1RM or more every session. And the endurance program itself was 6 days a week. It was 3 days a week of high intensity interval running, and high intensity interval cycling. And the running as well, it was like run as fast as you can for 30 to 40 minutes. So, and then the concurrent groups did both of those. So yeah, no wonder they had an interference effect. Like, no, you can't train like that. But then, since then there's been a number of studies exploring how we can kind of, periodize our training and alter training variables to be able to try and, maximize these adaptations.
Yeah, I've seen the Hickson paper, and I was very surprised at the whole, run as fast as you can for 30, 40 minutes, because
Yeah,
then I looked at the graph and I was like, I'm surprised they lasted to week 7.
yeah,
I'd have been
yeah.
knackered by week 2 and you probably start seeing a drop off. But it was really cool to have a study that was a bit outlandish as the first one, because it kind of
Yeah,
helps with it provides a base for that additional critique, which you then utilize to then create more studies to investigate the area further. But
definitely.
fantastic work. I just want to pick up on the idea around what you said about it's almost like a bit of I don't want to use the hierarchy, but sort of like hypertrophy, strength, and sort of muscular power. There seems to be this interference effect affects the muscular power or speed strength more than maybe the maximal strength, and then hypertrophy is even less. So it'd be really interesting to see what is it about endurance training or adding endurance training could affect the adaptations needed to develop those strength qualities. What kind of, I don't know if we're thinking neuromuscular or molecular, or what is it about the interference effect which could block or inhibit muscular strength or power adaptations? What is it about endurance training that then kind of inhibits it?
So I guess the interference effect can sort of be broken down into two concepts, really. There's like an acute interference effect and a chronic effect. So the acute effect is things like residual fatigue from a prior session, and this is particularly if you're doing the two modes close together. Sometimes if it's in the same session, or if you have a limited recovery between sessions, that a level of residual fatigue, and it may be neuromuscular fatigue, not recovering and transferring over to the subsequent resistance session. So, okay, let's think of this in the context of doing endurance first, then resistance. You do an endurance session, and there's a level of fatigue that carries over, and so we also might have, a level of muscle damage, muscle soreness, substrate depletion, that altogether is going to have a negative effect on the quality of the subsequent training session. So, if you're doing these in close succession, say we've done an endurance session first, and then we're going straight into a resistance session, all of these factors may be affecting how much I'm able to lift in that resistance session. And there are studies showing, from an acute perspective, that a prior endurance session can negatively affect strength performance. So there's studies that have looked at like the number of reps that you can do in a session, and showing significant reductions compared to not having done that beforehand. And I guess likewise that also kind of would translate for people doing resistance exercise first and going into an endurance session. And the level of kind of neuromuscular fatigue and muscle damage that you get from a resistance session may be also far greater than what you might get in an endurance session. And again, so then going into that endurance session, the quality of the stimulus that you're giving the muscle may be reduced because of that, all those factors affecting fatigue and affecting the quality of your training session. And then from the chronic side of things, or the training side of things, is like repeatedly performing suboptimal training sessions over a period of time is going to have a negative effect on your adaptations. If you're not training at your best, then you're not going to adapt to your best. And coupled with that is also just the inherent differences in differences in endurance and resistance adaptations within the muscle. It's kind of challenging the muscle of the different kind of metabolic and morphological and structural demands that it needs to meet, whether it's been getting an endurance stimulus or a resistance stimulus. So there's kind of these two kind of acute and chronic interference effects, I guess.
Mm. And does that tie into, say, if you had to you were doing strength sessions but focused on hypertrophy, you can generate a session that creates the right metabolic environment for hypertrophy type adaptations to occur, even when slightly fatigued from something other training. Whereas for like maximal strength and maximal power output or speed strength, you need that that residual fatigue not to be there, because all of a sudden the decreases in neuromuscular output is then going to clearly affect your ability to do that in the strength session, and therefore you don't improve as much because your neuromuscular system's almost like knackered.
Yeah, definitely. There've been many studies that have shown concurrent training to induce improvements in, say, maximal dynamic strength and lean body mass, but measures of explosive power output are hindered. So, I think it comes back to what you were saying about more neuromuscular mechanisms are probably at play here. So, factors that are going to affect your muscles' ability to, like the rapid activation of motor neurons, are going to be, negatively affected. And it, like you say, in terms of the hypertrophy, that probably sways a little bit more into like some of the molecular signaling, which you asked about just before, and that's probably a little bit more of my background. And so the idea behind that is that when we do any exercise, we switch on signals, molecular signals in our muscle that respond to some sort of contractile stimulus. It might be an endurance stimulus, it might be a resistance stimulus, but we're switching on these like pathways, if you will, that when you repeatedly switch these proteins on and these signaling pathways, they are involved in promoting specific adaptations. So in the case of endurance exercise, some of the classic ones that are studied is like AMPK, P53, PGC1 alpha. These are all like, targeted genes and proteins that when they're repeatedly stimulated over time, they switch on this kind of process that leads to improvements in like mitochondrial biogenesis, where we increase the number and the function of our mitochondria, and other like angiogenesis and other structural and functional adaptations that promote endurance adaptations. And with resistance exercise, I mentioned before, the mTOR pathway is a classic studied pathway that's stimulated by resistance exercise that promotes protein synthesis. And when we're repeatedly stimulating that pathway, we get an increase in muscle proteins. And so there's this idea from a molecular point of view that one pathway might interact or interfere with another. And a lot of this evidence comes from cell culture studies and studies in rodents. So there's another classic one that was by Phil Atherton back in 2005, where they basically stimulated rodent muscle with an endurance type stimulus. So very low frequency but prolonged stimulations, and then a resistance type stimulus, so really high frequency stimulation. And then they looked at like the pathways that were switched on. And what they found is that when you stimulate the muscle with an endurance type stimulus, it switches on this AMPK mitochondrial type, signaling pathway. And when you switch on the resistance part, when you give a resistance stimulus, you then get this switching on of the mTOR pathway. And so it kind of brought up this idea of that, when you do one, you're going to downregulate the other, and vice versa. And that, concurrent training may induce a negative molecular environment for your muscles to adapt. But in humans, first of all, again, there's very few studies that have kind of explored this. But there's very little evidence in humans to suggest that this is happening. And in fact, there's studies showing concurrent training can initiate similar, if not greater, signaling responses in the muscle. So very different to what we see in these like very tightly controlled cell culture and rodent studies. Like when we look at humans, there's a lot more variation, and there isn't enough conclusive evidence to say that there's this molecular interference effect, and that, you know, if I do a resistance exercise and then do an endurance exercise, it's going to switch off mTOR and I'm not going to adapt, sort of thing. And I think some of the reasons why that is, why there's like such a inconsistency between what we see in these cell culture and rodent studies and what we see in human studies, is a lot of these techniques can be quite variable and have a lot of error and variability in the techniques themselves. And we're obviously looking at humans, and you've got individual responses to training and nutrition and things like that. And also a lot of these studies have very small sample sizes as well, so it's often quite difficult to see clear effects unless we have like hundreds of people doing these studies. So at the moment, you know, my own research, we looked at this, and I'm probably rambling on a bit now, but we wanted to explore this molecular interference effect, and specifically from the context of concurrent exercise order. So does the order in which you do these exercises affect the subsequent, you know, signaling responses that we see? And we also kind of wanted to look a little bit about a training status as well, and how that impacts the signaling responses. And so we did this 10-week training study, and in the first week and the 10th week, we took a series of muscle biopsies. So on the first day of each week, the participants did either resistance-only training, resistance then endurance, or endurance then resistance. And we took biopsies like before and after each exercise bout throughout the day, and then repeated all of that again in week 10. So it's a big study. Like, I think it was 13 biopsies per person, and I think we collected about 340 odd biopsies in total. And basically what we found is that haven't really seen any clear differences between the resistance-only group and the concurrent groups, and the exercise order on the effects of signaling responses. We just kind of see this generic kind of response to the exercise. And we also have we also looked at rate changes in muscle protein synthesis, and we found that there were no differences between the concurrent groups and the resistance-only group in terms of how that training stimulated muscle protein synthesis. It's just another piece in the puzzle at the moment.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, whenever I think of concurrent training, people automatically go straight away to, it's the AMPK that's blunting the mTOR pathway. They go straight for the molecular. Whereas that's, as coaches, or the stuff that we can manipulate, which is technically the training session itself, the thing we have most control over is how much acute and chronic fatigue we can create with our programming. Yeah. So it's weird how the molecular side seems to be more well known regarding the interference effect compared to basic residual fatigue, which you should know anyway if you're programming, because you should be keeping that into consideration, even if you were doing concurrent training or just focusing on strength or just focusing on endurance. But yeah, fascinating to hear, especially your work, because, you know, that's like something that's relatively well known in the sports science world. And you're coming here saying, well, you know, yes, from cell culture studies, it's saying this, but from our work, or our limited work in humans, actually, it's not really saying that at all. And while we understand there might be differences in our measurement techniques and the error associated with that, we still don't really know if this interference effect molecularly actually exists. So that's really quite a fascinating look at concurrent training, and maybe one of the reasons why we're seeing, especially in the last 5 years, so many people really pushing the boundaries of concurrent training, where you're seeing people, you know, squatting 250 kilos and still running a sub 5 minute mile. You know, these aren't, you know, sports, but if you join them together, that's really quite impressive. So yeah, it does kind of explain a lot as well of what's going on.
Yeah, and I think the monitoring of fatigue is an interesting one and an important one. I think I listened to the episode that you did previously with Johnny Payne and talks a little bit about monitoring, how your athletes or your clients or even yourself, if you're training, are feeling kind of coming into the sessions, because that is going to have a huge effect on motivation to train. And in our training study, we kind of took a few additional kind of secondary measures, and so this is in the performance paper that was published last year. So we just asked our participants to complete a simple kind of well-being questionnaire coming into each session, and then also used session RPE to kind of get an indication of their internal load after each session. And that in itself was quite interesting. When we looked at the resistance training sessions that the participants completed, the guys who had done a HIIT session, an endurance session before coming into that resistance session, were reported worse scores for well-being, soreness, I think stress and mood. And in terms of the internal load scores, so the session RPE scores, they perceived that resistance session to be a lot harder than the other two groups who were either just doing resistance training alone or doing resistance then endurance. And so those were the only differences in kind of subjective perceptions that we picked up on. We didn't see any differences when we looked at the endurance training session. But I thought it was interesting with that in that resistance training session. It just more as a reminder that to look into that sort of stuff. And I even just anecdotally speaking to participants, like some of them in the HIIT then resistance group would say that they didn't enjoy particularly training that way, and they would normally train the other way around. So obviously, when we're talking about trying to improve, maximize athletic performance and things like that, then we might have, we've got to incorporate and be guided by scientific principles that are going to get these athletes to the top of their potential. But also for untrained and recreationally active people who are just looking to kind of get fit and improve their overall strength and endurance fitness, I think taking into account your personal preferences when it comes to exercise order is also important, and that you may not need to worry too much about the order in which you're doing it. If doing your cardio first, then your weights is what's going to get you into the gym and training, then absolutely go with that. I don't know, any training's better than none, at some levels.
That kind of touches on what I wanted to ask next, was if you were doing an endurance session and a strength session on the same day, which order would you have it? Maybe in the AM strength and the PM, or vice versa. But I guess, if it's their preference because of maybe wellness or, RPE values from the work you've done, sort of, or whatever you feel is not going to affect that second session the most, just do that one first. That kind of does make sense. Do you think previous training would really affect that as well? So, for example, I would classify myself as slightly more strength trained than endurance trained. So, because of that, my perception of how hard an endurance session is probably higher than a strength session. And for someone that's been doing running, as a runner, been running for years, a hard interval session on a track is probably going to perceptually fatigue them less than a intense gym session. Do you think that's a real big factor when it comes to maybe making a decision of ordering training within a day?
I wouldn't say I know too much in terms of training status and the effects that might have on perceptions of effort and kind of motivation to train and that sort of thing. But in terms of the effects of training status on concurrent training adaptations, there was actually a really interesting meta-analysis that was published earlier this year that, and for, I guess, for listeners who might not be familiar with what a meta-analysis is, it's basically where you combine the results of several studies that are, rather than doing an individual research project, you kind of set a search criteria and collate all of the results from studies that meet that criteria. And it's an opportunity to kind of give you an overall look of what's happening in the field. So as I mentioned before, with some studies that have very few participants, you might be limited because you don't have enough participants to see any big effects. Well, then by combining all of those results together, you then suddenly got data points from hundreds, if not, 1,000 participants. And so you can kind of have a better indication of what's happening. And so there was this meta-analysis published that I think was the first of its kind, really, to try and quantify the effects of participant training status on dynamic strength was the main variable that they looked at. And it's a really difficult one because how do you define training status? There's a lot of variation in terms of the definitions between studies. At what point are you considered trained? So like in my study, for example, I got people who we classified as moderately active. They were sort of exercising 2 to 3 times a week, but weren't following a structured training program, which is what was a sort of definition that was used in this particular meta-analysis. And so, the guys in my study, they trained for 10 weeks. Are they classed as trained by the end of that 10 weeks? Probably not. But in this meta-analysis, the untrained participants, they classified as being either sedentary or not having done any structured training for 3 months prior. Then I think moderately trained were those who, again, hadn't really done a structured training period for 3 months. Or I'm testing my memory now. But they were sort of habitually exercising a couple of times a week. And then the trained were either considered athletes or had like a prolonged training history longer than 3 months. I might have to double check those definitions, but the overall outcomes of the study were that for the development of dynamic strength, the interference effect was a lot more profound and significant in the trained participants. So trained participants from the studies that were included had a significant interference effect to dynamic strength. They didn't see an effect for untrained participants, and they also didn't report an effect for moderately trained people. But the results kind of suggested that it was kind of heading that way. It's one of those, it's not quite statistically significant, but it's that in between. You're a few points off, getting close to significance. But yeah, the most profound effect were in highly trained individuals. And again, that was also, they did a few sub-analyses trying to look at how some of these training variables affected that interference effect. And it was more profound when sessions were performed in the same day and less than 20 minutes recovery between sessions compared to a longer recovery period of at least 2 hours or more. So I guess it seems like there may be potential for a greater interference effect as you become more trained. And again, I guess not to go off on too much of a tangent down the molecular route here, but some of the studies that have looked at these molecular responses to training do suggest that when you're completely untrained and you do any type of kind of exercise, be it endurance or resistance, these kind of adaptive molecular pathways in your muscle are kind of all firing, like everything's being switched on. It's just like, the muscle is just trying to adapt to this unfamiliar stress. And then over a period of time of like structured training, and as you continue with that training program, the molecular responses start to become more refined and more mode specific. So, there's potential that as you become more highly trained and as these sort of signaling responses become more specific to each mode, that's where you might start to see this molecular interference effect. Now, again, as I say, we didn't see it in ours and we did a 10-week study, but again, you could argue, are those participants trained by the end of 10 weeks? And really what you'd want is to get a group of people who are completely untrained and then follow them for like 2-3 years of regular concurrent training and resistance only training and endurance only training. We'll do a few biopsies along the way and track how that changes and really change their training status. But again, it's I guess a question of, if anyone's listening and has the money to fund that, please drop me a line. And it's just a case of like resources and time. And we can instead look at cross-sectional studies. So there was a really interesting study by Vernon Coffey back in 2006 in John Hawley's group, where they got highly trained endurance and highly trained resistance athletes who weren't doing concurrent training. They were purely training for those modes. And what they did is they got them to do an endurance session, do a resistance session, and then they swapped over and did their sort of unfamiliar mode. And again, what they found is that like the participants who were strength trained, when they did cycling, there was a big increase in this AMPK protein that's like sort of detects molecular kind of molecular stress in the cell. But when the cyclists did the cycling, you didn't see that response. And likewise, when the cyclists did a resistance training session, there was a big increase in AMPK, so again sort of suggesting a big molecular metabolic stress. And also they saw an increase in some of the proteins that are involved in protein synthesis and translation. But for the strength trained guys, when they did a resistance session, there weren't any kind of significant increases. It was a much dampened response. So it suggests that as we become more trained, the responses in the muscle become more mode specific and more, I guess, dampened. Those guys are used to doing those modes, but then when we're crossed over and did an unfamiliar bout of exercise, it's like everything's being switched on. So yeah, as I say, training status is definitely going to have a big effect on whether you see, I think, an interference effect or not. We perhaps just don't have enough long-term studies to really, be able to kind of track the time course of when that occurs.
Yeah. No, really cool. And on top of that, you said there was a lack of more the elite side of participants get involved. Kind of understand, because if they were competing in a particular sport, they wouldn't really want to take 12 weeks out of their training for it to do a particular study, where the study's aims were to find something out regardless of what their aims of the sport are. So it must be quite hard to find out that information. And then in my head, I'm thinking, well, if they're more trained in their particular sport, their volumes and intensities of training that sport are going to be higher as well. And if we know that those particular factors could influence this as well, that's more information that we kind of show. Well, it's information that shows that the interference effects could be larger because they can train harder at their specific mode. Yeah,
volume and frequency are definitely two variables that I guess need to be properly managed. And again, in terms of specific studies looking at the effect of volume and frequency, there haven't been all that many done to like empirically, test the effects of them. But in terms of the frequency of concurrent training, there was a study done by, I think, Thomas Jones from Northumbria University, and he basically looked at the effects of comparing resistance-only training 3 days a week to two concurrent groups. So whereby one of the groups, they did concurrent training 3 days a week, back-to-back, and another group, they did concurrent training, but they only did it every third day. So they did 2 sessions of resistance only, and then on that third day, they did endurance training. And from a strength development kind of perspective, they showed that as the frequency of concurrent training increased, the the adaptations to strength were lower than the group that just did sort of every third day. So along with that, there's another kind of highly cited meta-analysis from back in 2012, which also looked at some of these sub-variables and how they affect strength, hypertrophy, and power. And they suggested that the adaptations of strength, muscle mass, and power were lower as you increased the duration per session of the endurance training, as well as the number of sessions per week. So there's no kind of I guess like hard and fast rule or a specific number, but the overall kind of looking at the literature at the moment, it's sort of, and studies that have shown an interference effect and those that haven't, it kind of seems like 3 sessions or less seems to be a kind of good number to work off to try and, in terms of a frequency, to minimize the interference effect. Just kind of from the perspective of endurance training, as I say, a lot of my background has kind of looked at how endurance training affects resistance adaptations. But, what about the endurance athletes? They need to incorporate resistance training into their programs as well. And there's actually some pretty compelling evidence to support the inclusion of resistance training into endurance training for improving endurance performance, which I guess may seem a bit surprising, but there've been a number of studies that have shown cycling and running performance to be improved by adding heavy resistance training, and it's particularly studies have incorporated heavy resistance training or explosive resistance training. Quite often it's sort of 2 days a week for 8 to 12 weeks, and they report quite significant improvements in time trial performance, improvements in running and cycling economy, and things like that. So it's kind of weird. Like the interference effect seems to like go one way, but not the other. Certainly, from an acute perspective, you still have the same concerns. Doing a resistance training session there's gonna be, depending on how close you do them together, there's gonna be the risk of residual fatigue and neuromuscular fatigue and all that sort of stuff as well. So that needs to be managed on an acute perspective. But there have been, as I say, a number of training studies with in endurance athletes, elite cyclists, runners, rowers, and that's those kind of populations that have shown performance improvements with heavy resistance training. Now, obviously, if you're listening and you're not from a resistance training background, then first and foremost, you've got to kind of work your way up and get the technique right. Start light first, and don't just go into the gym next time and start lifting the heaviest weights you can. And because I told you to, that's but certainly, with the right program, even 2 days a week, as I say, for 8 to 12 weeks. And interestingly enough, depending on the phase of the competition or training that you're in, there are some studies showing that those adaptations in maximal force and running economy and things like that can be maintained even with as little as one heavy resistance training session a week for about 20 weeks. So, for endurance athletes, it might be possible to, if you're in a general training phase, increase the resistance training maybe 2-3 days a week. And then as you start to move towards more competition-specific training, bringing that back to sort of maybe 2 sessions a week. And then when you're in competition, even 1 session a week has been suggested to be sufficient to kind of maintain those adaptations while you're competing. Sorry, I've gone on a bit of a tangent there. And
that's wicked, and kind of leads into one of my final questions, actually, especially what you were saying around the minimal you need to do to try and maintain a certain level of strength is really quite telling. People, if they want to improve both components, endurance and strength, maybe sometimes they probably might be doing too much. They could probably still improve by reducing the overall volume or frequency, but still combine them. So it's going to be individual dependent. But then your other thing you said around less sessions a week, and you shouldn't really be too much affected. Because I'm thinking a lot of people that will listen to this podcast won't be in a situation where they can train like 2 to 3 times a day. They might be able to get a good session of maybe an hour and a half a day. So you'd like to think quite possibly that if you're only training once a day and you spread out your endurance and strength training appropriately throughout the week, hopefully that's a good way of actually minimizing the level of the interference effects, and you might be able to improve both concurrently or slightly more on endurance. You're going through like an endurance phase, you slightly push that, going through a strength phase, slightly push that. But either way, you can still improve both if you have, without having loads and loads of volume or frequency.
Yeah, definitely. Like, and it's kind of difficult because when you talk about these training variables and how best to kind of minimize the interference effects, like I find myself going around in circles, probably much as I've probably done a bit on this podcast, like, because you can't talk about one and then like not then factor in all of the others. Like, for example, best case scenario, if you're trying to train concurrently, the longer recovery you can leave, the better. So, if you're able to do both on different days, then perfect. As you say, some people might not be able to train twice a day, kind of separated by, a period of hours, and they might have to do both in the same session. Potentially athletes, potentially, even just recreational gym goers, you want to get them both done in the same session because it's time efficient. Everyone's got busy lives. So then what do you do? So then your recovery time's limited. So the order then kind of potentially becomes more important. And I know we talked about sort of the subjective, potential subjective effects of that, but I guess more going back a little bit onto the exercise order and for, same session training, if you're doing cardio and resistance training in the same session, what the literature currently suggests is that for dynamic strength improvements, it may be better to perform your resistance first. Whereas adaptations like VO2 max, body compositional changes, don't seem to have as much of an order effect. So the other sort of conclusion that I've sort of gave in our paper is, in addition to sort of being guided by personal preference, is also just being guided by your training goals and what your particular targets are for whatever phase of training you're in. And again, it sounds like common sense, but I think it is. Like if you're trying to improve resistance adaptations and that's your goal, then it would make sense to do that first when you're fresh. You're going to be able to lift as whatever loads that you've been prescribed, and then the cardio is supplementary. So I'll do that afterwards, and I'm not as bothered if I don't get as quality session for that. Then you might kind of go into a phase where actually, I want to get my cardio up and I want to improve my endurance adaptations and get a good stimulus in those sessions. Well, then do those first again if you have to do those in the same session, and perhaps play around with the resistance training load and so that you may not be able to lift as much in those sessions because of that residual fatigue, but you've kind of made that choice because the goal is endurance training. So it's just balancing that based on what your goals are, really.
Yeah, definitely. Ultimately, when you're planning the week, you're going to have what we like to call our hot sessions. They're the ones that are going to be the ones where intensity is probably at its highest. And if you use like a bit of like an 80-20 Pareto's rule type of thing, like you've got 20%, that key exercises or key sessions which are going to create the response that we want from the week, and the rest is all supplementary. So ultimately, whatever falls into that 20%, it could be if you're trying to develop, weightlifting performance, it could be like the key lift of that session. Make sure that goes first. because that's when you want to be most fresh, and then do whatever you can with the rest of the training week to try and make sure that you are freshest at the point where you know that that particular training stress is going to link most to your training goals. So it comes to, general sort of strength and conditioning practice in a way, and week effectively.
Like when you boil it down and when I don't know, when I've been talking to people or they've asked me about like my research and that sort of thing, like, I don't know, sometimes I think people are a bit surprised that the recommendations are kind of, they seem like just, common sense, like you say, just training principles 101. But like, it's kind of easy to get wrapped up in a lot of the other stuff, like the molecular side of things. And, it definitely does have a place, and certainly what we're trying to explore more of. But at the end of the day, it's like, what are your goals? And do, manage your training appropriately as you can, with recovery in between, and, doing the right things, I guess, nutritionally. And that could, be a whole other topic, and just doing these things that are going to help you to achieve your goals.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think it's really important to know the science behind what's actually going on in the human.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
But, you're right, as in certain people probably place too much emphasis sometimes on certain things, which then affects their programming decisions. So can be used for good, maybe used for something that might not be as they intended, maybe. But Matt, thank you so much for that. That was absolutely brilliant. Do you have any, it was nice to finish on kind of final recommendations there. I thought that was wicked. Do you have any, where can people find you, especially your research in this area? I'd
say probably best is on Twitter. I wouldn't say I'm hugely active on social media, but Twitter is it's just Matt_Lee1. I'm not quite sure how I managed that. I wasn't particularly early to the Twit party or anything, but just Matt_Lee1. Just shoot me a message. More than welcome to get in touch. I've got a ResearchGate profile as well if anyone's interested in looking at any of the papers as they hopefully come out soon.
Definitely recommend everyone listening to, if you want to find out a little bit more about this area, check out Matt, especially on his ResearchGate and his Google Scholar profile. That's how I first came across his work.
Oh yeah, Google Scholar. I always forget about that.
Yeah, so do I.
Yeah, put that up as well.
But that's how I first came across your work, and then I wanted to learn more, so I got in contact. So thank you so much for coming on to Progress Theory.
Oh, no problem at all. Thanks for having me.
No problem. Cheers, pal. Thank you.
Thanks.